Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with the Mookse and the Gripes bucket list book tag, which is an original tag created by SHAWN, the book maniac, and it is inspired by one of his favorite podcasts, which I have never listened to. I'm really excited to have found a new podcast through this tag, but I will link to down below the podcast and all of the information that SHAWN has in his video. Essentially, this tag is having us list 10 books that are on our reading bucket list, books that we really would like to read before we shovel off this mortal coil, as SHAWN says. And so I have a list of 10 books, and some of these are books that I'm genuinely intimidated by, and they're on my bucket list because I think reading them would be an achievement. But other books that are here have just been on my TBR for a really long time, and I'm not totally sure why. I have never picked them up. I'm really confident that I'm going to love these books in most cases. They just, for some odd reason, have lingered on my shelf for years. One of the options we have with this tag, though, is to have you guys vote on which book on our list we should really prioritize by a certain timeline. Now, for me, many of these books are super long, so I'm not going to promise that I could get to any of them by the end of this year, but maybe by the end of next year. So please let me know in the comments down below which book of these you would prioritize or you would like to see me prioritize. And I would also love to know 10 books that are on your bookish bucket list down below. So let's just get started. These are going to be in no particular order. The first that I have written on my list is a book that I think is on a lot of people's bookish bucket list, and that is Ulysses by James Joyce. In truth, I can't even tell you what Ulysses is about. I would assume it is in some way an Odyssey retelling, which doesn't really appeal to me. But what does appeal to me about Ulysses is the fact that I have heard from nearly everyone who has read it that it is a book rife with literary references. It is a book really about other books. And so that really fascinates me, and I tend to really like novels and works of literature that play with things like that and really interact with the literary canon. And that kind of excites me about Ulysses. I've always kind of thought Ulysses is a book that I will put on my bucket list, but that I likely will never check off. But the more I hear things like that, the more intrigued I actually am by the book. I think it's going to be one of those works that requires a lot of you as a reader, and thus I think it's one that's going to require a lot of work from me, particularly as a reader. So this is one that is definitely on my bookish bucket list, and I have no earthly idea when I would ever have time to read it or when I would ever fit it in, but it is definitely very high on my list. Next up, I have Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell. And this is one that I'm so torn on. I've gone back and forth with Cloud Atlas many times over the years because this is another one that I really can't sum up for you. I don't really know what the plot of the book is. And I've heard from a lot of fans that that's actually the ideal way to go into Cloud Atlas. You should kind of go into it not really knowing what to expect because it is such a wild journey. But everything I've heard about it really makes me feel like I would like it. A lot of people whose reviews I trust put Cloud Atlas among their favorites, which is really encouraging to me. But Cloud Atlas is one that I am fairly apprehensive about because I do believe it deals quite a bit with philosophy, and that really is always a hard sell for me. You guys probably know that by now, that I sometimes philosophy and I can agree, but most of the time it's very difficult for me to wrap my brain around. I don't think I'm a very philosophical person at heart, and so I've always had the sense that if I tried Cloud Atlas, I would probably really struggle with it. But I do think at the end of the day, it would be a worthwhile struggle. I think I would leave the book really happy that I had finished it, and I probably would really favor it. I think it would become one of my favorites. Next up, I have The City of God by St. Augustine, or St. Augustine, as I tend to call him. I recognize now Augustine is actually the way it should be said. But this is a work of the 5th century. And so it is a classical piece of literature, but it is also a very religious work. And so this is, of course, talking about the so-called City of God. But what really intrigues me about City of God is not even really the religious aspects of it, though I do know I would find that really fascinating, but I am really fascinated by the fact that this was apparently written in response to Alaric and the Goths sacking Rome in 410, and everyone thought that Rome was the city of God and thought that the world was ending because of this. And that is just genuinely one of the most fascinating time periods in human history to me, is when the Roman Empire was falling in the West. And so this is, I think, dealing with that and trying to address people's fears by saying no city on earth is the city of God. And then I think it does also stray quite a bit philosophical in discussing what the ideal city of God is. This is one I know will take me a really long time to read, and I struggled a lot with Confessions, which is St. Augustine's autobiography. I think I had a fairly poor translation of that. I'm not going to blame that on Augustine, but I really struggled with that. That was a very deep and introspective work, and it was also fairly difficult to read for me. So that is another reason why I've been put off of City of God. But this is one that I would really like to prioritize in the new year. I would really, really like to make 2022 the year of reading City of God. Faith of Faith in Books, and I will link to her channel down below. She's planning on reading it throughout 2022, and I really hope she does, because I need a group of people to help me with this. I'm gonna need guidance through this. But this is one that I think will get off the bucket list sooner than some of these others. Next up, I have the Mahabharata, which is an epic poem from India, and it is an ancient epic poem. And it's actually much longer than this edition of the work makes it seem. This is an abridged edition, and I can't fathom how long an unabridged edition would be. But this is one that will also, I think, move off of my TBR fairly soon, because I am planning on budding reading this with Tanya from Bookish Topics soon. It will take us a very long time to read it. We both know that, but we're both really, really excited about it, and I hope that it's helpful to the both of us to read it with someone else, because I have been intimidated by the Mahabharata for a long time. It's been on my TBR for years, and the reason I'm intimidated by it is not that it's poetry. I really like epic poetry, and I believe this edition actually translates it as prose, but I feel like you need some background knowledge to go into this a little bit. So I'm hoping that the introduction here will be fairly informative. But I did used to read as a child, it seems, illustrated editions of stories from the Mahabharata. So maybe I will feel a little bit more comfortable with this as I get into reading it and I remember stuff like that. I'm sure it was, a very edited version for children, but I recall that. I recall reading an illustrated version of different stories from the Mahabharata. Do any of you remember that? Is that something that I've just hallucinated? But I think that I'm probably going to get more comfortable with this as I read it. The intimidation factor here, I expect, will go down as I start to read it. A recent addition to my TBR that is now on my bookish bucket list is The History of the Russian Revolution by Leon Trotsky. When you see how big it is, you know why I've had to put it on the bucket list. Because when I ordered this, I thought this is just going to be a nice, short, introspective look at the Russian Revolution. And I thought that I read the dimensions wrong on thrift books, and then this arrived. And I realized that the dimensions were not wrong. It is truly a massive book. It's really, really tall too. And I think it's probably going to be fairly dense. So Leon Trotsky was a participant in the Russian Revolution from a very particular side. And so this is a work that I think is going to be fascinating, because he is somebody who really witnessed these events and actually played a part in some of them. And I believe he kind of changed his tune as the years went on, because this is a book that was banned in the USSR when he finished writing it in the 1930s, I believe. So I think the version of events that he really wanted to tell was not the version of events that Soviet Russia wanted told. So that's also fascinating to me. I was hoping to read this for Nonfiction November this year, but I just don't think it's going to happen. It's just huge. It's definitely a book that I'm going to have to take my time with. I also think I am probably going to have to keep a notebook alongside this and take notes on everything, because I imagine this is going to be rife with a lot of information. At number 6, we have Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And I have an abridged version of this. This is the abridgment, but there is a 3-volume Penguin set, which is the ideal. That's the one that I actually want because I want to say that I read this in total. And so this is a work of historiography that was published in the 1700s, and it was truly influential on the study of history and on how history was written. There's a lot of Edward Gibbon's personality on the page, which I think makes it one of the first instances where you can feel a historian's bias and where the historian is trying to persuade you of something rather than just telling you the facts. And so I think Edward Gibbon really believes Christianity is tied to the fall of the Roman Empire, but I've heard his writing is really beautiful, and it's apparently a history that has aged very well. So I'm really fascinated by this, but I want to read it in full. I don't really want to read this abridgment of it. When I read it, it might be only once. It might be only one time that I ever actually read The Decline and Fall, and I would really like it to be in full. I would really like to say that I read The Decline and Fall in totality. So I am looking to get those 3 volumes and hopefully start on that at some point in time. I don't know when, but this is another that has lingered on my shelf for a long time. I'm not necessarily intimidated by this. I know it's long, but this is, like I said, one of my favorite historical time periods. And so I just would really like to read it. I don't feel very intimidated by this one at all, though it definitely is a long one. This next book, I'm really not totally sure why it's still on my TBR. Nothing about it truly intimidates me. It's one that I've said I wanted to read for a very, very long time, and at this point, I have no idea why it is still sitting on my bookshelf, and that is Dune by Frank Herbert. Now, this is a sci-fi classic, and sci-fi can be a bit of a hard sell for me, but I've often heard Dune described as being like sci-fi fantasy, as being a fantasy story told in space, which really appeals to me and makes me believe that I would probably really like Dune. Dune has some really intense fans, but it also has some really intense haters. And so this is a book that I expect to feel very strongly about either way. I've heard that Dune is told in a very interesting way and that sections of the book are kind of spoiled by small bits of description that come at the start of the chapters, I believe, or at the start of each section, and they'll spoil that a character dies, and you would rather have read that when it happened than have it spoiled for you. And that doesn't necessarily bother me. I actually kind of like that. And I would really like to get to this before the new film comes out in October. So this is one that has got to move off my bucket list, and it's got to do it soon. Next up, we have The Mysteries of Paris by Eugene Sue, which is a 19th century French classic that is absolutely massive. If you have seen a physical copy of it, you know just how big it is. This is a book that was serialized, and I'm not quite sure if it was inspired by something else or if it just really inspired its own genre. But I believe there are quite a few mysteries in this that you are trying to solve. And I'm just really intrigued by this. I've heard so much about it over the years. And I actually saw a copy of this when I went to Paris a few years ago, and it really intrigued me because I saw it on a river walk, the stalls by the Seine, and it was an older copy of it that was still in serialization form. And I just was really, really fascinated by that. And it was apparently a pretty popular thing because I saw many people go over to it. And so I wondered why I hadn't heard very much about it. And it has been on my TBR ever since. I'm really fascinated by this. But this is a book that is truly over 1,000 pages. And I've heard it doesn't feel that long. I've heard it's very engaging. But I've also heard, as with many books that were serialized, there are parts of this that are really slow, that really drag, and there are parts of it definitely that you believe could be cut. And this is overall my problem with long books, is that I often do not feel as though they should have been that length. And it's hard for me to justify spending so much time on something like that when you think, oh, I could have read so many other books in the amount of time that I was reading this, and I wouldn't have felt like they dragged. I wouldn't have felt like so much needed to be cut from them. So this is one that I have the sense I'm probably really going to enjoy parts of, but I also think I'm going to wish parts of it hadn't been included. But this is one that I would really, really like to get to, but I have no idea when it would happen. When I sat down to do this, when I saw people posting this tag and talking about books that have been on your TBR for a long time, I decided to go to Goodreads and see what the first book I ever added to my want to read shelf on Goodreads was, because I knew that at least the first 4 or 5 I still haven't read. I got a Goodreads in 2012, I added a few books, and those at the top of the list, those that I initially added, I for the most part still haven't gotten to. So I knew, number one, the first book that I ever added on Goodreads had to be on this list, and that is American Lion by John Meacham. This is a book that I think is still viewed fairly positively by American historians. This is a nonfiction book about Andrew Jackson, who was a U.S. president in the 1800s. And this is, I think, specifically about his presidency. But to confess something about myself to y'all, which I think will make you judge me, Andrew Jackson is my personal favorite American president. I love Andrew Jackson mostly because there are so many really funny and witty personal anecdotes about him, but Andrew Jackson was also a pretty terrible person, and so I am really interested to read a nonfiction book that really looks at him through a non-biased lens. I don't think this book is going to do that. As I've said before, and I'll say it again, I don't really know how you can write a book about a singular person without being invested in them. I don't know how you can write a book about a singular person and not like them at all. That seems very weird to me, that you would ever dedicate months of your life researching and writing about a figure that you hated, which is not to say that hasn't happened in the past, but I would really like a nuanced view of Andrew Jackson because I think that's really fascinating. But this is the book that has been on my TBR the longest, apparently. So this is one that I definitely should get to, but it is one that I think has aged in some ways. I think this was a real huge bestseller at the time that it came out, and then it has fallen off a little bit, though I think in certain circles it really is still viewed fairly favorably, which does excite me about it. But I have had this for who knows how long. It has been on my TBR for almost 10 years at this point. I think it's time that I should probably try to make sure that this gets off the bucket list. Last but not least, at number 10 is Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. This is one that I am still genuinely confused by. I don't know why this is still on my TBR. I have never felt so sure that I would give a book 5 stars as I feel about Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. I know that it would work really well for me. I read Piranesi last year by Susanna Clarke and loved it. And I know that this book just has everything I love. It's historical fantasy. I think it's got beautiful prose. I have read the first few chapters, and a scene takes place in York Minster in York, England. Excuse me, that's just my vibe. So I don't really know why this book still sits on my shelf. I have a Kindle version of this, so it's been there for a very long time. I'm not really sure why I've never taken the plunge with this other than the size of it. I do think it is fairly long, and I do think it would be a bit of a commitment. It would be a book that I would spend a lot of time with. But if I loved it, what does that matter? So that's the last book on my bookish bucket list, and I would really love to know down below in the comments which book you think I should prioritize. Which book should I get to by the end of 2022? I would love to know down below what are some books that are on your bookish bucket list or books that have lingered on your TBR for way too long. But that's going to be all for me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.